Hi there, my name is Orestes Ponce de Leon, and you are listening to the Cobra Effect podcast. In this show, I cover the unintended consequences of government policies throughout history. We delve into 4,000 years of how even the best intentioned ideas can backfire, leading to revolt, failure, and shocking events. In this second part, we continue traveling 1,700 years back to the Roman Empire, when Emperor Diocletian tried to curb inflation and, to this end, he enacted the Edict on Maximum Prices in the year 301. This edict was a detailed list aimed at controlling 1,400 prices and salaries, including singular products such as camel hair, vulture's feathers, and loincloth. But why did Diocletian need to be so detailed? Why would a man who claimed to be the son of the god Jupiter be concerned with the price of camel hair? Because inflation was a disease killing the empire. Through this 8-part series, we will learn in detail how the Roman state worked for the 300 years of the early empire, and how, as public expenses kept increasing and the sources of revenue kept decreasing, debasement and inflation followed. Today, we will see one of the public expenditure programs that led to this inflation, the public games. In this episode, we will explore the types and examples of both festivals and the public games they were associated with, the infrastructure the empire built to provide such spectacles, and the cost this all represented to the imperial coffers. As a general trend, we will see how the Ludi, these public games free of charge to the spectators, kept increasing in number and degree of lavishness. In the previous and first part, I said that the following was very important to understand why inflation was Rome's public enemy number one. As a general trend, military and public expenditures were always increasing. Public expenditures such as imperial handouts and cash gifts, the state bureaucracy, public construction works, the free distribution of food we saw in the previous episode, and the public games we will see in this episode today. To cover these ever-increasing expenses, there were specific sources of imperial income, such as mining precious metals and other materials, the spoils of war, and the confiscation of the elite's property. But these sources of revenue were neither everlasting, like for example mining, nor constant because the spoils of war and confiscated property were a one-time deal. How many times a year are you going to sack an enemy city or take away the property of someone? So, as a somewhat more reliable way to cover the expenditure, the Roman emperors depleted the treasury and raised some taxes, but it was not good enough. As an alternative solution to get their hands on cash, the emperors debased the currency, and with it, inflation followed. As a result, when Diocletian took the throne in the year 284, inflation was already undermining the foundations of the empire. I also mentioned last week that, unlike modern states, the Roman state was unable to finance itself by covering deficits through public debt. Furthermore, trade outside the empire's borders left a deficit. At the beginning of the previous first part episode, I described the order in which I will cover all these subjects throughout this 8-part series. Also, in the previous and first part, we saw in detail the cura annoni, the free distribution of food in the empire as part of its state expenditure. In this second part today, we will talk about the expenditure on public games, a topic that may sound trivial when considering the empire's overall economy. I certainly thought so before doing the research, but I was wrong. It is an important issue to look at, and an important part of the public expenditure of the Roman Empire. It also turned out to be a fascinating topic, and I hope I can convey why. So let's begin. Juvenal was a Roman poet who lived during the height of the empire. In his collection of poems named Satires, published in the early 100s AD, Juvenal writes, and I quote, "The mob that used to grant power, high office, the legions, everything, curtails its desires and reveals its anxiety for two things only, bread and circuses." End of quote. That phrase, bread and circuses, panem et circenses in Latin, came to represent, back then and throughout history to this day, the basic and trivial ways in which power entertains the masses and keeps them distracted from what is really important. By the way, in case you wonder, this circus is not what we know today with clowns, elephants, and all that. It refers to an elongated oval track surrounded by tiers of seats where Romans would watch the public games, especially the chariot races. We already saw in detail last week the bread part of this equation, the cura annonae, and its system of free food distribution. But what about the circuses that Juvenal mentioned? In this episode, we will discuss the festivals, the public games, the buildings where these games were held, and the cost. The high cost of providing free and lavish spectacles to the people of the city of Rome and throughout the empire. Romans appreciated many things, especially a good party. The feriae publicae were public holidays, usually with a religious background and connotation, during which most businesses were suspended. There were three types of feriae publicae: the feriae stativae, which were held every year on a fixed date; the feriae conceptivae, which were held every year on days appointed by priests or magistrates; and the feriae imperativae. The feriae imperativae were held on special occasions, for example, to celebrate the victory or to celebrate the birthday of an emperor or a god, known as dies natalis, the anniversary of the ascension of the emperor to the throne, known as dies imperii, or the anniversary of the divinization of the previous emperor, a process known as apotheosis. Just describing the list takes a while. There were processions, sacrifices, prayers, banquets, feasts, most of these activities or all of them as part of the same festival. It would depend on the occasion. You may have heard of some of these festivals, like the Saturnalia, held between December 17th and 23rd in honor of the god Saturn. During this time, eating and drinking had no limits, gambling was allowed, and slaves and masters would eat together at the same table. Saturnalia was one of those festivals held not only in the capital city of Rome, but throughout the empire. Because, of course, although some celebrations were specific to the city of Rome, other parts of the empire had their own specific festivities. Now, as the Republic gave way to the empire, the number of quote-unquote special occasions increased. The birthdays and victories of emperors accumulated, and old festivals held regularly were revived and updated to the splendor of Rome and the magnificence of whoever sat on the throne. In his book Daily Life in Ancient Rome, the French historian Jérôme Carcopino tells us that, and I quote, "The list of holidays changed from reign to reign, but the additions seem to have outnumbered the subtractions. For we know that Claudius, Vespasian, and Marcus Aurelius all found it necessary to cut down the number of holidays." End of quote. The Roman calendar had 365 days with an additional day every 4 years. In the 2nd century AD, the number of holidays for festivals had already grown to 159. Emperor Marcus Aurelius lowered them to 135 in the year 165 AD. But stopping this festival/party inflation was destined to fail. The calendar of Philocalus, written in the year 354 AD, records around 200 holidays for festivals, and this, tells us Jerome Carcopino, is only considering regular festivals held on set dates, not special occasions decreed by the ruler in power. Lots of numbers, but in conclusion, there was a holiday for every working day, and the ratio only increased over time. This is specific to the city of Rome, but as we saw in the previous episode, Rome was by far the largest city the world had seen until that moment. The city reached an estimated peak of between 800,000 and 1.2 million inhabitants. Even after the decline and fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD and the dramatic depopulation of the city of Rome itself, it would take the world around 400 or 500 years for another city to reach a similar number of inhabitants. I am referring to Shanghai in China and/or Baghdad. The point is that the festivals in Rome involved a lot of people. If you wonder who was working then, well, the slaves. They were supposed to take it easy during festivals like the Saturnalia, when they sat at the table with their masters, and they even had a full day break every August 13th during the 3-day festival of Nemoralia in honor of the goddess Diana. It is estimated that between 10 and 20% of the population of the empire were slaves, with higher numbers in the cities. In Italy, the proportion of slaves was as high as 30%, according to some estimates. Also, someone had to pay for the celebrations. For the most part, it was the Roman state. Now, the Ludi, which in Latin means games, were the public games usually held as part of the festivals I mentioned before to honor the gods and later the emperors. Festivals and public games were linked. As you can imagine, many festivals also meant many public games sponsored by the state and more money from the imperial coffers. A quick parenthesis, there were also private games organized and paid by wealthy individuals. For example, starting in the Republic around the 3rd century BC, the Oxford Handbook of Sport and Spectacle in the Ancient World tells us that, and I quote, "The spectacle of gladiatorial combat was found almost exclusively in connection with the funerals of great men to honor the deceased, and became known as munus offered to the community." End of quote. Munus meant duty, in singular. But since the times of the empire, these gladiatorial combats, or munera, the plural of munus, gradually lost their private funerary context. So moving forward, when I say games or ludi, I mean all public games sponsored totally or partially by the Roman state, including munera, the gladiatorial combats. Sometimes in the literature you see the term munus and its plural munera used also to refer to the duty the local elites had with the governance of their local communities. But that's a topic for another episode in this series. So, as with festival inflation, starting early in the empire, this is in the very early 1st century AD, the number of days devoted to public games increased from around 93 days to 175 days by the mid-300s AD, according to the calendar of Philocalus. Games were a special type of imperial propaganda, a way for the elites to connect with the common folk, to remind them of how lucky they were to be living in an era of such prosperity. Something like, "These are fun times and you are lucky. We have reached peak lavishness." Again, panem circenses, bread on circuses. It was also an opportunity for the emperor to be seen by the public face to face. After all, when the Republic was transformed into the empire, the venues for mass political participation and expression were drastically diminished, and politics became an even more vertical decision-making process. Seeing the emperor enjoying the same spectacle as the common folk, was a way to give the impression that he was approachable, an illusion of shared power and prosperity. Emperor Claudius, for example, used to address the people, and from time to time, he called them domini, meaning masters. Spectators could make direct petitions to the emperor right then and there. That's one of the reasons why emperors like Titus or Trajan were popular. Pliny the Younger tells us the following about Trajan, and I quote, "What generosity went to provide this spectacle, and what impartiality the emperor showed, unmoved as he was by personal feelings or else above them. Requests were granted, unspoken wishes were anticipated, and he did not hesitate to press us urgently to make fresh demands. Yet, still there was something new to surpass our dreams." End of quote. Obviously, Pliny the Younger was a big fan of Trajan. Now, first, let's see some examples of games, and afterward, the types of games. Probably the first of these games held regularly and associated with a festival was the Ludi Romani, translated as Roman Games, which were celebrated annually starting in 366 BC for 2 weeks in September in honor of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, the chief god of the Roman pantheon. Other examples of Ludi that began during the Roman Republic were the Ludi Plebae, meaning plebeian games, established to boost morale during the Second Punic War against the Carthaginian general Hannibal. There were also games that took the names of the divinities and their festivals, such as the Ludi Cerealis, dedicated to the goddess of agriculture, Ceres, and the Ludi Florae, dedicated to the goddess of flowers and spring. New games were also decreed to celebrate military victories, for example, the Ludi Victoriae Caesaris, to celebrate the victory of Julius Caesar over Pompey. These are just some examples of annual games. There were many, many more, and as with the festivals, in addition to the annual games, there were ludis every 4 years or on special occasions. For example, the secular games, that were supposed to celebrate the end of an era every 100 or 110 years. The truth is that many emperors celebrated lavish secular games ahead of the 110-year mark for political reasons to gain prestige and popularity. Augustus celebrated them in 17 BC, Claudius in 47 AD, Domitian again in 88 AD, Severus in 204 AD, and Philip the Arab for the last time in 248 AD. These were lavish and expensive games with ceremonies and sacrifices of animals as part of the religious connotation of the celebration. And there were theater plays, chariot racing, staged animal hunts in the circus, gladiatorial combats, and feasting. Lots of food. The Romans enjoyed many types of ludi, and they did not have to pay. All of this was free, because the imperial Roman state paid for it from its treasury. We all know about the gladiatorial games, but there were also chariot races, staged naval battles called naumachia, and beast hunts called venationes in plural. Let's start with the venationes. It is interesting to note that as the empire expanded, the number of animals for these spectacles also grew. You see, there is a trend here. Festivals and public games grew in quantity and lavishness over time, as did other imperial expenses, such as the state bureaucracy, the military, and the cura annonae we saw in the previous episode. And all of these had to be paid for. That's the main point to keep in mind. So, the first emperor, Augustus, claimed that 3,500 animals were used for entertainment during his reign, a number that pales in comparison with the 9,000 that Emperor Titus used during the 100 days of festivities to inaugurate the Colosseum in the year 80 AD. Around 2 decades later, to celebrate his victory over the Dacians, Emperor Trajan held games for 120 days, where 11,000 animals were hunted in the arena. Trajan reigned during the period of the largest territorial expansion of the empire, and although later on, the number of animals used in the venationes did not break that record of 11,000 animals, successive emperors were not shy about spending money on this particular game. The Roman historian of the time, Cassius Dio, narrates the celebrations and games held by Emperor Septimius Severus in the year 203 AD, and I quote, "On the occasion of the 10th anniversary of his coming to power, Severus presented to the entire populace that received the grain dole and to the soldiers of the Praetorian Guard gold pieces equal in numbers to the years of his reign. No emperor had ever before given so much to the whole population at once. The total amount spent for the purpose was 200 million sesterces." End of quote. And Cassius Dio continues, and I quote, "The arena in the amphitheater had been constructed so as to resemble a boat in shape, and was capable of receiving or discharging 400 beasts at once. And then, as it suddenly fell apart, there came rushing forth bears, panthers, lions, ostriches." End of quote. This recreation of a shipwreck full of beasts brings me to another game, the naumachia, meaning naval combat. Although celebrated on very special occasions, this extravagant and expensive game consisted of recreating famous naval battles of the past. In the year 46 BC, to celebrate his victories in the Civil War, in addition to the usual games, Julius Caesar ordered the construction of a basin by the river Tiber, and there 6,000 men fought in a naval battle. Roman historian Suetonius tells us the following, and I quote, "Such a crowd flocked to all these shows from every quarter, that many strangers had to lodge in tents, pitched in streets or along the roads, and the crush was often such that many were crushed to death, including 2 senators." End of quote. Later on, Augustus ordered the construction of a larger artificial basin in order to stage naval battles as well. The largest naumachia was presented by Emperor Claudius in the year 52 AD. To celebrate the draining of the Fucine Lake, Claudius had 19,000 prisoners on 100 ships to represent a past naval battle between Rhodians and Sicilians. Nero also ordered the construction of a wooden amphitheater to stage a naumachia. Cassius Dio tells us, and I quote, "Nero suddenly filled the place with seawater so that fish and sea monsters swam about in it, and he exhibited a naval battle between men representing Persians and Athenians. After this, he immediately drained the water, dried the ground, and once more exhibited contests between land forces, who fought not only in single combat, but also in large groups equally matched." End of quote. As we can see, this is a testimony to the ingenuity of Roman civilization, but also to its extravagance. It is even thought, although it is a matter of debate, that Emperor Titus and later on his brother Domitian filled the Colosseum at least once during each of their reigns to stage naval battles. As I mentioned in the first part of this series, the coins depicting the cura annoni were propaganda tools used by emperors to portray themselves as providers of food abundance. Here, the venationes and naumachia also portrayed a message. The hunt for wild beasts symbolized the emperor's and Rome's victory over the chaos of the barbarian world. The naval battles, fun as they were for the people, were also a clear message of engineering prowess. Look at what I, the Emperor, am capable of offering you, the people, as entertainment. As a final type of game, we have chariot racing. This was the real deal. When we think of Roman games, we immediately think of gladiators, thanks to Ridley Scott's masterpiece movie Gladiator, the first part. But charioteers were the superstars of the time. Let me put it in perspective. Michael Jordan is the richest athlete of this time. Business Insider estimates his net worth at approximately $2 billion, while Forbes elevates the sum to $3 billion. After Michael Jordan, we have Tiger Woods with $1.7 billion, Cristiano Ronaldo with $1.1 billion, and so on. Very impressive, but nothing compared to Gaius Apuleius Diocles, a charioteer who, after miraculously surviving a long career, because chariot racing was a dangerous sport, amassed a fortune of today's equivalent of $15 billion. So popular were the chariot races that the Roman author Pliny the Younger wrote the following in a letter to a friend, and I quote, "I have spent the last few days among my papers with the most pleasing serenity you could dream of." You will ask how that can be possible in the middle of Rome. Because the Ludi circenses were taking place, a form of entertainment which does not appeal to me at all. The games have no novelty, no variety, nothing, in short, anyone would want to see again. This makes me even more astonished that so many thousands of grown men should be repeatedly possessed with a childish passion to look at galloping horses and men standing upright in their chariots. End of quote. Pliny the Younger was definitely not the soul of any party. However, there is a revealing detail in his words, and that is the sheer number of people who were watching the chariot games. You see, the largest stadium in the world today is in India, with a capacity of 132,000 people. The second largest stadium is in North Korea, with a capacity of 114,000 people. But what if I tell you that, pretty much like the comparison between Michael Jordan and the Roman charioteer Diocles, today's largest stadiums pale in comparison to the Circus Maximus, where many of these chariot competitions took place. Located in the city of Rome itself, the Circus Maximus had an estimated capacity of up to 250,000 spectators. This is the combined capacity of today's two largest stadiums, plus another 4,000 people. The Romans had three main types of buildings for entertainment in the following order from most to least seating capacity: the circus, the amphitheater, and the theater. A small caveat here is that there were other structures, such as provisional entertainment facilities built ad hoc and dismounted after the games, or the hippodromes in the eastern part of the empire. But let's focus on the three main permanent entertainment buildings. Another caveat is that the circus, amphitheater, and theater were multipurpose structures, and it was possible for different forms of games to take place in them. A circus was an elongated oval track surrounded by tiers of seats along both sides. In the middle of the oval track was a barrier called spina, meaning backbone. The spina was decorated with columns, statues, and obelisks to divide the oval track into two sides and prevent crashes. We can see this in the movie Ben-Hur. I highly recommend it. In addition to the Circus Maximus that I just mentioned, the capital of the empire had the Circus of Caligula, also known as the Circus of Nero, which was located in what is now St. Peter's Basilica. Rome also had the Circus Varianus, built in stages by the emperors of the Severan dynasty, and finally the Circus of Maxentius, built in the early 300s. The other structure was the theater, a semicircular auditorium with rows of seats in steeply sloped tiers. The stage was on the straight edge. The history of theaters in the Mediterranean dates back centuries before the Roman Empire. The Greeks were big fans of theaters. Now, as the third structure, an amphitheater resembles two theaters facing each other. It is elliptical, with the seats facing the center toward the arena where, for example, gladiatorial games would take place. So far, the first certainly datable amphitheater we have is the one in Pompeii, dating from 75 BC. But of course, the most famous one is the Flavian Amphitheater, popularly known as the Colosseum. It was completed in the year 80 AD, after about 10 years of construction. It is one of the most well-known, if not the most well-known, of the Roman buildings. No need to go into deeper detail about the Colosseum, but there are a few facts worth revisiting. The first is its seating capacity. Let me put it in perspective. As of the moment I write this episode, the largest baseball stadium in the world by seating capacity is the Dodger Stadium in the US. It can accommodate up to 56,000 people. The seating capacity of the Colosseum is estimated to have been between 50 and 80,000 people. The second and third largest Roman amphitheaters were in Italy, in Capua and Verona, and they could accommodate up to 60 and 30,000 people respectively. So massive were these structures, designed and built to entertain the people for free, that in medieval times the amphitheater of Arles, in what is now France, became a fortified town with 200 houses and 2 chapels. Entertainment was not only important as far as seating capacity. We also must keep in mind the number of entertainment buildings. All the following numbers are estimates, but I love to play detective and quantify things, even though I know it can be risky when discussing ancient history. So, the total population of the Roman Empire at its peak, right before the year 165 AD, when the Antonine Plague killed at least a third of the population, was between 60 and 75 million people, and about 1/5 of them lived in cities. Then, on average, around 13.5 million people lived in cities, having easy access to circuses, amphitheaters, and theaters. As of today, we know of between 260 and 280 Roman amphitheaters with a seating capacity of around 3 million spectators. Doing the math, almost 1 in every 4 or 5 people living in urban areas had access to entertainment in amphitheaters for free. It gets better if we count more than amphitheaters. When we count the circuses, which, remember, had a larger capacity, it is estimated that there were around 40 in the west and 17 in the east. So, as far as we know today, there were around 57 circuses in total. There were also hundreds of theaters across the whole empire. For certain that I could find a study about this, there were at least 345 in the western side. So one could say that, hypothetically, on a single day with all spectacle buildings at full capacity, let's push to the max, 1 in every 4 or even 3 residents of urban areas had access to free entertainment. Plus, every year we discover more of these buildings. If you Google New Discovery, Roman, Amphitheater, you will find the following headlines. From 2022, a gladiator arena, possibly the last ever built, discovered in Switzerland. From 2023, archaeologists find Roman military amphitheater in Israel. Also from 2023, Roman amphitheater discovered at ancient Ategua in Spain. What about the other types of entertainment buildings, such as theaters and circuses? Well, from 2023, an article in Forbes reads, Nero's ancient theater discovered in Rome. In 2024, an article in La Vanguardia reads, Evidence of a 5,000-seat Roman circus discovered in northern Spain. You get my point. There were some amphitheaters and circuses built during the late Roman Republic. Very few though, and it is with the empire that these few previously existing amphitheaters and circuses are expanded and embellished. The Circus Maximus in the city of Rome is an example of this. In the East, some of the theaters were inherited from the previous Hellenistic kingdoms. The same was true of hippodromes, also used for entertainment later in the empire. However, most of the entertainment facilities that were part of the Roman urban landscape were built anew during imperial times. The Colosseum is an example of this. Now, were they expensive? Well, let's look at the Colosseum, the most famous of the Roman amphitheaters. Dr. Garrett Ryan, creator of the YouTube channel Told in Stone, estimates that the Colosseum may have cost 100 million sesterces. But what does this mean? Let's put it in perspective. Emperor Titus inaugurated the Colosseum in the year 80 AD, and Emperor Domitian completed the final details in the year 82 AD. Military spending was the most important of all imperial expenditure. After all, the survival of the emperor himself depended on it. Total military expenditures on salaries and benefits per year were around 450 and 550 million sesterces at this time. By the way, later in 84 AD, Domitian increased the salaries of military personnel by almost one-third. So, on the one hand, we have the Colosseum for 100 million sesterces. Built in around 10 years, we have 10 million sesterces per year, just to keep the numbers simple and clean. On the other hand, total military expenditure under Vespasian, Titus, and the first years of Domitian averaged 500 million sesterces per year. After comparing the two amounts, the cost of the Colosseum accounted for 2% of all military expenditures per year. Imagine that in this world today, for 10 consecutive years, a government takes 2% of a country's annual total defense budget to construct a single entertainment building. That's as if in 2024, from the Department of Defense budget, the US government spent, after 10 years, $170 billion to build a football stadium. Today, the most expensive sports and entertainment facility in the world is the SoFi Stadium in LA, California. Its price tag was $5.5 billion, more than double that of the next stadium in the ranking. So, the cost of the SoFi Stadium was $5.5 billion. Around $170 billion is the cost of the imaginary US government-sponsored Colosseum, where everyone would have free entrance, as in the real Colosseum. It's crazy. I got carried away with these numbers, but you get the idea. Now, the Colosseum was funded by the proceeds of the sack of Jerusalem and its wealthy temple in 70 AD. Emperor Vespasian ruled from Rome, and his son and successor Titus led the siege of Jerusalem during the First Jewish-Roman War. In what was probably an architrave that covered a passageway in the Colosseum, scholars have deciphered an inscription that reads, and I quote, "The Emperor Titus Caesar Vespasian Augustus ordered the new amphitheater to be made from the plunder." End of quote. It's understood to read, the Emperor Titus Caesar Vespasian Augustus ordered the new amphitheater to be made from the proceeds from the sale of the plunder. Vespasian and his sons got a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to ingratiate themselves with the people of Rome. But not every emperor had the Temple of Jerusalem to sack, and the Colosseum, although the most spectacular of amphitheaters, was not the only entertainment building in the empire. As we saw before, people living within the borders of Roman cities enjoyed free entry to approximately 260 or 280 amphitheaters, 57 circuses, and hundreds upon hundreds of theaters, for certain more than 345. All of this, while modern archaeologists discover new entertainment buildings every year. The cost of these many constructions for spectacle was too high for local private benefactors to fully fund from their private pockets. In the times of the late Republic, Pompey paid for a fabulous theater in Rome. But Pompey Magnus, Pompey the Great, was no ordinary man. He was extremely wealthy and shared power with Caesar and Crassus in what we know as the First Triumvirate. There were remarkable exceptions, but there were not many provincial Pompey Magnus around with the political influence and wealth to fully pay for a circus or amphitheater in a province like Britannia or Hispania Baetica. Certainly, local elites contributed, and again, there were exceptional individuals that we will see in the third and next part of this series. For example, Herodes Atticus and his theater built on the southwest slope of the Acropolis of Athens. However, the bulk of construction costs for entertainment buildings were borne by the state at the local/provincial and the central levels. We will talk in the next episode about private funding of local constructions such as baths, arches, etc. But a circus or an amphitheater were just too expensive to be fully privately funded. In his pioneering and monumental book, Roman Circuses, Arenas for Chariot Racing, scholar John H. Humphrey tells us the following, and I quote, "The evidence suggests that monumental circuses were always likely to be beyond the resources of a town and/or its private benefactors. As Richard Duncan Jones has pointed out, even amphitheaters were not built from private resources. The cost of a monumental circus surely required government intervention at a level well above that of the local town council." End of quote. Knowing the cost of entertainment buildings to the imperial coffers is impossible. However, we can certainly deduce that it was a significant item of state expenditure. Furthermore, evidence suggests that the last few of these constructions in the west of the empire took place in the first half of the 300s AD. This means that the vast majority of the expenses for infrastructure to provide these free spectacles to the masses occurred before Diocletian's edict on maximum prices in the year 301. I mentioned earlier that throughout the empire, provisional entertainment structures were built and dismantled after each game. But with a permanent building like an amphitheater, a theater, or a circus, well, why would you pay for such an expensive project just to have games sporadically from time to time? In the long term, providing frequent games was probably even more expensive than the buildings themselves. During the empire, as we have seen throughout this episode, public games grew exponentially in number and lavishness in the city of Rome and the provinces. Outside of the city of Rome, there was a scheme of co-sponsored funding for regularly held public games. The evidence is scarce to give an exact picture of who was paying what and where. Furthermore, the empire was vast. But the Lex Ursonensis can put some light on this. The Lex Ursonensis is the foundational charter of the town of Urso located in modern Spain. A bronze slab copy from the 1st century AD tells us that, depending on the title of the senior official, they were required to organize gladiatorial or theatrical spectacles. For this purpose, they were to take no less than 2,000 sesterces from their own money and up to 2,000 or 1,000 sesterces from public funds, depending on the position of each of these officials. In addition to senior local political offices, the high priests of the imperial cult in the provinces were required to personally contribute to fund the spectacles. These are the priests of the cult of the deceased and divinized previous emperors. Over time, this duty became a financial burden on the private wealth of these individuals, as, for example, the price of gladiatorial games kept rising. In the first half of the 2nd century AD, Emperor Hadrian granted permission to the high priests of the imperial cult in the small city of Aphrodisias in modern Turkey to finance the construction of an aqueduct rather than sponsoring gladiatorial games. The priests had argued that they could not afford to pay for the games. Around 50 years later, in the year 177 AD, when Commodus began to co-rule with his father and predecessor Marcus Aurelius, they had to set a price limit for gladiators to contain the ruinous expense such responsibility represented to local religious and political authorities. Although one can be certain it was Marcus Aurelius' idea, it is ironic that Commodus was on board with the idea of reducing prices for gladiators in the provinces. The man spent money on spectacles as if there was no tomorrow. He even took part in them. That was something that Ridley Scott's movie Gladiator, the first part, got right from a historical perspective. Although he was not killed in the arena of the Colosseum by Maximus Decimus Meridius. Some emperors themselves sponsored games outside of Rome, as confirmed by 2 ancient Roman sources. This is what Suetonius tells us about Caligula, and Cassius Dio wrote that Hadrian, and I quote, constructed theaters and held games as he traveled about from city to city, end of quote. Of his 21 years on the throne, Hadrian spent half the time traveling the provinces. He was a restless man. In Rome, the cost of ordinary games was shared between the state treasury and the private funds of the senior government official responsible for organizing such Ludi. These co-sponsored games were regularly held at a fixed time of the year, and the total costs were limited, meaning that they were not as impressive as the extraordinary spectacles provided by the emperor himself. As we saw before, public spectacles were an essential part of imperial propaganda during a military victory, the emperor's birthday or funeral, and so on. The primary sources of the time give us an idea of how much emperors liked to spend providing spectacles for the people in the city of Rome. For example, about Caracalla, Cassius Dio says, and I quote, "The emperor himself kept spending the money upon the soldiers, as we have said, and upon wild beasts and horses." End of quote. Caracalla loved the chariot races and the venationes, the beast hunts we saw earlier. Now, hold on to your chairs. Listen to what Suetonius says about Nero. And I quote, "At the games, which he gave for the eternity of the empire, which by his order were called the Maximi, every day all kinds of presents were thrown to the people. These included 1,000 birds of every kind each day, various kinds of food, tickets for grain, clothing, gold, silver, precious stones, pearls, paintings, slaves, beasts of burden, and even trained wild animals. Finally, ships, blocks of houses, and farms." End of quote. Can we put a tag on how much was spent on public games? A number. At least when it comes to gladiatorial games. This is a brave attempt that Professor Thomas Scanlon makes in the Oxford Handbook of Sport and Spectacle in the Ancient World. I will quote some parts of the text, and I quote, "Roman games, Ludi, occupied about 2.5 months of the Roman calendar in the 1st century BC and rose to almost 6 months every year by the mid-4th century AD." End of quote. This inflation of public games was caused by the inflation of festivals I talked about at the beginning of this episode. Professor Thomas Scanlon then explains how the public games were financed, how they were free of charge to spectators, and how the price limit for gladiators that Marcus Aurelius and Commodus set in the year 177 AD is a good index of the costs. Taking this cost reduction into account, Professor Thomas Scanlon estimates that empire-wide, annual gladiatorial games cost an average of 90 million sesterces before the reforms of 177 AD and 65 million sesterces after the reforms. He then writes, and I quote, "We can compare that with the total annual military costs, estimated to be about 670 million sesterces in about 150 AD. In short, the annual cost of gladiators in the mid to late 2nd century AD amounted to between 10% and 13% of the military budget. Note that the gladiator costs are only a portion of the total annual costs for Roman spectacles, which would be much higher if we included the costs of circus events, beast hunts, and so on." End of quote. He concludes that, and I quote, "Arguably, then, the cost of spectacles could have been about 20% of that for the military." End of quote. Certainly, some of it was covered by the private wealth of local provincial elites and authorities, but the majority was covered by provincial state coffers and then by the emperors themselves. That's quite a lot for the state coffers. Entertaining the masses was certainly expensive for the empire's public finances. To summarize, in this episode, we explored the types and examples of festivals and public games, the infrastructure the empire built to host such spectacles, and the costs this all entailed for the imperial coffers. As a general trend, we saw how the Ludi, these public games free of charge to the spectators, and the infrastructure to provide such games, kept increasing in number and degree of lavishness, from which we can conclude that their cost to the imperial coffers kept increasing over time. But public games were not the only expense the Roman state had to cover. As we advance through these 8 parts and make progress in understanding the full picture, the issues discussed will become more complex and the episodes will grow longer. In the previous and first part, we talked about the state-sponsored distribution of food, the cura annoni. In today's second part, we talked about the state-sponsored public games, the Ludi. In the third part, we will discuss 2 other imperial expenses, handouts as gifts in cash, and public construction works. In the fourth episode, we continue exploring the remaining expenditure items, the state bureaucracy, and the largest expense of all, the military. In the fifth part, we will touch on whether the Roman Empire could finance these public expenses through public debt, and whether the empire lost or gained money through trade. We will also talk about the short-term or unpredictable sources of revenue to cover these expenses. I am referring to mining, the spoils of war, and confiscations from the wealthy elite. Later in the sixth and seventh parts, we will see the subjects of taxes and treasuries, respectively, as they were long-term or more predictable sources of revenue. Finally, in the eighth and last part, we will talk about debasement, inflation, Diocletian's edict on maximum prices, and why it failed. I want to conclude the topic of these 2 episodes already covered of bread and circuses with this phrase I love from historian Jerome Carcopino, and I quote, "A people that yawns is ripe for revolt. The Caesars saw to it that the Roman plebs suffered neither from hunger nor ennui." End of quote. Thank you for listening. For additional information and social media links, you can visit thecobraeffectpodcast.com. You can support the show on Buy Me a Coffee or become a monthly member. Links on the website. You help me to cover my costs, and your contribution keeps this project going. Feel free to also reach out via social media or email. The email address is contact@thecobraeffectpodcast.com. I would like to hear your questions, comments, or ideas for a future topic. See you in 2 weeks for another episode of the Cobra Effect Podcast.